infeasibility.
Can't do
Sorry, go
everything
ahead,
that's
Jack.
logically possible.
He just said it wasn't logically possible.
I never said that.
Yeah, you said it wasn't logically possible for there to be a world in which all creatures freely choose the
I never
good,
said
right?
never
Let's say
said
that it is logically possible, right?
Mhm.
What prevents God? What prevents God from bringing about such a world? Because
The
it's
very thing I
infeasible?
just explained.
Sorry, did you
No, the
say it
very-
was infeasible or not?
It may be infeasible for God to create the best
You
world.
said it was infeasible, right?
I mean, can I answer?
Yeah, I'm asking you,
You
did
have
you
a
say it
problem,
was
Jack.
infeasible or
You have
not?
Jack, you have a problem.
Did you say
You're
it
not
was
able to wait.
infeasible or not? Did you
Jack.
say it was infeasible or not?
Jack, nobody's going to play your game here.
Oh, just answer the
He did
question.
say-
though.
If you want to talk, if you want to
The
talk on
point
a
is,
level,
the point
Hang
is,
on,
right?
I'm
The
gonna say another
objection is, right?
Jack, he's
that
gone. Can I ask you?
What we want to know is,
He's
that's
deafened.
fine. I'm not talking to him.
Okay.
The point is that the question is, in virtue of what can God not do that? What does it mean to say that it's infeasible, right? It's not logically impossible. It's not nomologically impossible, right? So what does it mean to say that it's infeasible?
Jack,
I had
asked him this like a little bit.
Can I give a scenario, please?
If let's say it's physical, let me just get this out and go right after me. I promise. Jack, I asked him this earlier, and I said, well, if it is logically possible, then you've kicked the can down the road to explain, well, if God could actualize it, and it's a better world, why doesn't he? And then he just said something about feasibility, and I asked him to explain it, and then he talked about like fathers and sons for some reason.
So Jack, can I give you a scenario?
Wait, I thought Josh wanted to say something.
Oh, I forgot what I was going to say.
All right. So let's say God wants to create a random number generator, and he desires that it outputs only once, right? Now, it's logically possible that then the random number generator only outputs once, right? Because they're all random. So a sequence of ones is logically possible. But is it possible for God to create a random number generator that necessarily only outputs once?
Wouldn't be random.
Exactly, right? So even though it's logically possible for a random number generator to exist that only outputs once, it's still not logically possible for God to create a random number
This is
generator.
you're just talking about logical impossibility, though.
And I think that's what he's referring to with the free will, right? So it's not logically possible for God to create free will agents that do exactly what he wants, right?
But you don't understand the problem with that view. Then, if what you said is true, that just shows that the view is incoherent. That's not creating a special problem. That's just showing that the view itself is incoherent.
Well, I think there's a difference in saying it's logically possible for something to occur than it's logically possible for necessarily creating that occurrence, right?
Look, the problem is, if it's logically possible, and we say ex hypothesis that God would bring about that world, God is omnipotent, then that would be the world that we're in, right? It's not the world that we're in.
Possible.
That's the world that we're in.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, the dark part is not in here, so unfortunately.
So do you guys not get my point? That's a really bad point I'm making. Because
your point just calls into question the idea of morally significant freedom in the first place. That's what I'm talking about, right? You say there has to be morally significant freedom, but if it's true that there has to be morally significant freedom, otherwise agents wouldn't be free. That means God wouldn't actually only actualize the possible world in which agents freely chose the good, and that conflicts with God's omnipotence, because that's what God would do were God good, and he's omnipotent, so we stipulate that he can do that. That just shows that conjunction of propositions is incoherent, because as you adequately pointed out, it leads to a contradiction.
Well, it leads to a paradox, maybe, but is it a true contradiction? That's the question.
Yeah,
it
is. That's the point of the argument.
Like, I'm not a philosopher, so you're using a lot of words that are hard for me to understand. So if we could just keep it to the random number generator example, right? what is logically contradictory in God not being able to generate a random number generator that necessarily only outputs ones? Like, it doesn't seem to be a contradiction for God to create a random number generator, and it doesn't seem to be a contradiction for God to desire that it only outputs ones, and it also doesn't seem to be a contradiction that in some possible world it only outputs ones. So where's actually the contradiction?
I mean, if you're stipulating that it's a random number generator, then the whole point is that the modality is parasitic on whether or not there are other options, right? Like, it always has to be the case that in some other possible world there's a different number given the same, presumably the same antecedent.
Sorry, I crashed out. Can you start again?
Yeah, I was saying what it means for it to be random is that randomness is parasitic on the modality, right? So you have to have all of the same set of antecedent conditions. In one possible world, you get one outcome, and in the other possible world, you get a different outcome. That's what it means for it to be random. So you can't just have one random number generator that exists in one world and only has one outcome, because that would just mean there is no random number generator. What makes it random is that there are other possibilities. That is to say, there are other possible worlds in which it produces other outputs.
Exactly, and God is not in control of these outcomes, right? So even though he desires there only being ones, and even though there's some possible world in which his desires would come true, he cannot force them to come true, right?
Right, but it's the point that you're making is just that either what you're saying is random number generators, forget morally significant freedom, either random number generators conflict with God's omnipotence, or they're logically impossible. That's just the dilemma that you're in now. Because
I don't see it, but maybe I'm mistaken.
Because look, if God has a specific world in which he wants a specific outcome, but he creates a random number generator in that. Like, say God has the desire to bring that about, and that's logically possible. Well, by the condition that God can bring about any logically possible world, what you just said is impossible, because he couldn't bring that about no matter what he did. Because given the same antecedent conditions, God's desires, whatever, it doesn't affect the way the possible world is actualized. So that's the whole point. Like, you're putting yourself in a position where you're just saying that the thought experiment is incoherent because either God can't create random number generators, or you have to give some different analysis of omnipotence where there are sets of logically possible worlds that God can't do anything about.
Well, I think it's logically impossible to force the outcome of a random number generator, right? But it doesn't therefore entail that there's not some sequence of numbers that can come out of a random number.
No, it doesn't. But what it does entail is that omnipotence, as defined as being able to bring about all logically possible worlds, or any logically possible world, given one's desires or whatever, is incoherent. That's what's entailed. It can't be omnipotent then.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I would stretch omnipotence to that level of logical possibility, right?
Wait, what does that mean?
Well, but that's what they were quoting Craig saying, right? And that's a very standard view.
Yeah, B3 was straightforwardly wrong when he said.
Yeah, but then you would have to say that it's logically incoherent, or something, or it's a logical contradiction to create a random number generator, right? And I just don't see that.
It's impossible for an omnipotent being to actualize any logically possible world, in accordance with his aims or whatever, but create a random number generator. That's what's impossible. And see, I think that you can see that very clearly, because if you build into the antecedent conditions God's desires for the outcome or whatever, it follows trivially that it can't be a random number generator. What makes it random is that God is not in control of the outcome. If God's not in control of the outcome, then he's just not omnipotent.
Yeah, I don't agree with that view. I don't think there's any law of logic violated by creating a random number generator. So yeah.
He's not saying that there's
I already
logic
said
that's impossible.
There's a contradiction though.
There
Like,
is
you
no
generate a
actual contradiction.
Well, a contradiction is like God is in control and God isn't in control, right? The omnipotence has been violated.
Look, if I say I am in control of all logically possible affairs, then I also say that there is logically possible affairs I'm not in control of. Do you think that's a contradiction?
Let's put it like this: like God.
Wait, stop. Just yes or no on that.
Well, you would have to ask me again because I was in my own thoughts.
No, that's fine. If I say that I am in control of every logical possible world, and then I say I am also not in control of every logical possible world, is that a contradiction?
Yeah, it sounds like a contradiction.
All right. Is that not the case that that Josh was referring to when he said those two propositions?
I mean, even take that definition of omnipotence. It's actually, I mean, even thinking about the definition of omnipotence is absolutely ludicrous. I can't believe I didn't notice this before. But like William Lane Craig's view, or like a classical theist view, typically God isn't logically necessary. They think he's necessary in some other sense. But what would it mean then for God to, like, that whole view where God can bring about anything that's logically possible? That's just incoherent because on their view, it's logically possible that God doesn't exist. God obviously couldn't pre-exist to bring that condition about.
Well,
Like,
hang on, you have to be
Actually, there
careful.
was
No,
They don't hold it to be the case that God can't exist.
when they talk about bringing about anything logically possible, the point is that you can bring about any logically possible result, and so any such result will be consistent with its nature and be logically possible.
Listen, buddy. I don't care about results-based views. Come on, that's silly.
So
Fuck.
James,
Yeah, but that's what Craig put forward, right?
So James, do you agree that it's a contradiction to create a random number generator that only outputs a certain number?
No, that's not the contradiction. That's not the contradiction, Dutch. The contradiction is when you have those two propositions at the same time.
Oh, okay, Jovan, do you think it's a contradiction to create a random number generator?
Are you listening?
No, you're not listening to me, right? Like, I've got a simple question. Do you think it's a contradiction to create a random number generator that necessarily outputs only a certain number?
A random number generator that outputs one number?
Yeah.
How's that random? It sounds like a contradiction.
No,
Yeah.
what he means is not that it outputs only a particular number, but that it outputs it at one time, right? It has a single output.
I think analytically it cashes out.
God cannot create a reality with that contradiction in it. Wait. That's why it's not a logical contradiction for God not to be able to create that reality.
Analytically, I think that translates to: is there such a random number generator that can be predicted? Right? That's just what there's an equivalence there. That's what he's saying, and that just seems straightforwardly a contradiction because random number generator is something that can't be predicted.
Dutch, when you said it always produces one number, you're saying it always produces a particular number, or it just always produces like a single number?
Whatever, it doesn't matter. A certain sequence.
It does matter. That's very different.
But which number is produced is still random, right? It's going to spit out one number, but what number that is random. So there's some possible world in which it's 7, some other possible world which it's some other number, and so forth, right?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be any number, right? But
okay, that's not a contradiction.
Okay. That's not a contradiction.
So, hold on. What is not a contradiction now?
Are you saying that the number is predictable?
No. We already established this. He's saying that there's a random number generator that spits out one number. That number can be anything. It's randomly generated, but it spits out a number. Is that a contradiction?
No.
No.
I'm saying a random number generator that's going to spit out 1,000,000 numbers, right? And God necessitates that it.
What just happened?
Wait. And God what?
And God necessitates that it's only the number 1 that comes out of it.
So God
If he necessitates it, that it's not a random number.
It's not random.
Exactly. So it would be a contradiction for God to create it, right? God cannot create a number generator that necessarily outputs the number 1. But God could design a world where the random number generator only outputs the number 1, right? And it's logically possible for that world to exist. but it's impossible for God. It would be
Wait, so you're saying that God is causing that number, though?
Yeah, I'm saying
it's not random.
Yeah, it's a contradiction for God to create a world where it's only outputting that number, even though it's not a contradiction.
No. It's not a contradiction for God to create a world in which it happens to only output that number, right? Because presumably there's some chance that would occur.
It, right? To necessitate that world.
Right. That's the contradiction. To necessitate that world is the actual world.
God cannot create a world where it will only output this number 1, right? Like a million times. Even though he desires it, he cannot force that world into existence.
But he can't force it to only output that number because it's a random number generator.
Exactly. Right. But even though it's logically possible for there to be a world where that random number generator is only outputting the number.
It's not omnipotent.
Right. When you say random number generator, wait. When you say,
well, this is not going to be a problem for results-based theory.
When you say random number generator and God created it, like I take that if God was creating a random number generator, he wants it random to him, meaning that he's not going to be able to predict or control the outcome.
I mean, if it's not random to him, then it's not random. So I don't know.
Yeah, if you're saying it's random to other people, then
control of it, right? Like
that's not the same thing.
Point of it being random.
No. This hinges on predictability, right? Because like clearly a random number generator that generates some X amount of numbers. There's a possible world in which it generates all ones, right?
Right.
But the idea when God commands it is going to be identical to him predicting it, or at least they're going to be picking up the same thing. So whether or not that's possible is going to be what hinges on the contradiction. So like when God picks the world, essentially he's predicting it, but that's a contradiction on what it means to be a random number generator because it's unpredictable by necessity, by definition.
It's definitionally not possible.
So then it becomes a contradiction in that an omnipotent being can't create a random number generator that they could, predict. But they're supposed to be able to predict anything if they're omniscient. So in a world where there are omniscient beings, there can't be a random number generator.
Yeah, I don't know who I'm debating now anymore, but do you agree?
But you understand the contradiction, though, right?
Well, I think there would be a contradiction in creating a random number generator that necessitates a certain outcome, right?
Right, that's what Josh said.
I can't hear you. You're breaking up from me.
Oh, I said this is what. Remember that guy you were talking to before, who was talking about the incoherency of God making a random number generator. Like that's just what he said like a while ago.
Yeah, but I don't agree with him, right?
But you agreed to the contradiction where like if God can't create a random number generator because God has to be able to predict everything in the world.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
So you don't think God can predict anything?
Well, even if he could predict what the outcome would be of him creating a random number generator, it still would not necessitate that he can force the random number generator to give a certain sequence.
Can he predict it?
It does. Yeah, the idea is like if you have a random number generator, right, by definition is unpredictable. So if you have the propositions that you get from a random number generator, which is something that's unpredictable, and you have the propositions from God, which is omniscience, which is to say everything is predictable. The contradiction is you have something that's something that can predict anything can't predict something.
Yeah, I think Dutch. The thing is that what he said is that omniscience entails some form of determinism. If you think about it,
I don't think omniscience contradicts the random number generator.
I'll explain it.
I don't think it's a contradiction for God to know which outcome the random number generator will give, and still him not being in control of what the sequence is, right?
Yeah, but that's not the point. It's not the point that God knows the So it's not the. So I think you're missing the point. It's not.
Are you talking to us from the International Space Station, bro? Jesus Christ.
Sorry. My room is empty now. Okay.
Your microphone connection. There's something wrong, seriously wrong with your microphone.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
There's a lot of guns behind you. There's a lot of gunfire behind you.
Oh, sorry for my background. That is.
No. Your mic
Somebody
is
here-
static popping.
Probably
You
doing
need
this
to
on
mute.
purpose, honestly.